Welcome back, everyone, to the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26 in Glasgow. I am Selena Abraham, and I'm joining you from COP26 TV. We're streaming live from inside the venue where we're talking to some of the great leaders who are pushing for 1.5 degrees. We've talked to CEOs, to journalists, young activists, policymakers, and I'm really excited that today, on Science and Innovation Day, we have with us Andrew Sims, who is the coordinator of the Rapid Transition Alliance. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today.
It's really nice to be here, Selena.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well. My voice is a little bit croaky because, like everybody else, we've been doing a lot of talking.
A lot of talking, but it's so important to hear the work that you're doing. I'm sure you have a great message to share with us for the audience. So you're coordinating the Rapid Transition Alliance. We hear the word transition a lot, but what does it mean? What is the work that you're doing? And really, why did you initiate it and set it up?
Well, I think the question on a lot of people's lips, obviously, is there hope? And the Rapid Transition Alliance was set up to look at the possibilities of achieving the kind of change at the speed and scale that the science tells us is necessary. Because that we all know there's a bit of a gap between commitments and pledges on what the science says. And I think part of that is because policymakers find it really hard, I think everybody finds it really hard to imagine, what does change like that really look like? So we set up to find evidence-based hope of the possibilities of change so that we can embolden policymakers and get over that belief gap. Belief in perhaps our own ability to change as fast and as far as we need to, and belief in the possibility of systems to change as much. So we asked the question, is there hope? And we look for evidence of it. And we're growing an international community of grassroots organizations, some big organizations, over 200 of them, looking for this evidence, trying to learn those lessons.
Can you tell us, in what areas are you finding these evidence? Where are you really kind of helping bring that hope to life?
Well, this is the extraordinary thing, because when the IPCC talked about rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented change that we need, the irony is that there's actually quite a lot of precedent when you start looking through history, internationally, in pretty much every sector, whether it's in food and farming or transport or energy or the design of our cities. We're finding evidence pretty much wherever we look. And what we're trying to do is take the lessons from that and put it in a form that can influence our own possibility of change and give a bit of a guide to policymakers to say that we can do this.
This is really exciting. I mean, I was hearing just earlier this week on, we hear about tipping points for climate, but there's also positive tipping points and the positive stories that we can really find and build on and find a way to kind of accelerate us towards the future that we want. So can you tell us, you mentioned that there were some lessons from history that help kind of see the vision of how we can go from commitment to action. And I'm curious, are there other things that we've learned in our kind of more recent history, the pandemic in the past couple of years? Yeah. What can climate action and those that are wanting to push it, what can we learn from the pandemic?
Well, we all know that the window for action is the next 5 to 10 years. We have longer term targets, of course we do, but we need to mobilize things. So what we've looked for are examples where in under 10 years, we've seen radical transformations. Now, we're only just a decade past the financial crisis. When the financial crisis hit, the way that we responded to that systemic threat to the global economy and people's livelihoods was extraordinary. And overnight economic policies, which would have seemed unimaginable, were found to bail out the financial system. The obvious lesson from that is that we can act virtually overnight and that we can mobilize resources on a scale bigger even than some of the figures that are being talked about here. I mean, when you look at what's being pumped into economies to keep them going, to keep them ticking over, and now we're all talking about building back better. We talked about that too back in 2008. And in fact, back in 2008, with a mixture of economists and green energy experts, we came up with the proposal for the Green New Deal. Now, there was some green stimulus spending back then, but not at the scale that's needed. Now, here we are again. Things are still a little bit dodgy in the global economy, and we're building back from the pandemic. And the amount of resources we're putting into that all needs to go to the low carbon and socially just transition. So the financial crisis is a fairly recent one, a really obvious one that tells us what we can do. But we can go back further. We can go back to when we've seen energy shocks, like at the time of the OPEC crisis, and how people responded to make sure that everybody would have fair and equal access to what energy there was available. In the United States, in the UK, we put in plans to provision for making fair shares available to people. The end of the Cold War is another one. A brilliant example, massive industrial conversion away from military spending towards more peaceful purposes. We created jobs in civilian sectors at an extraordinary scale. That happened, and we need to bring some of those learnings and lessons back in. But we can go back even further. Now, hopefully, a lot of people came to this conference by train. If you go back to the 19th century in Britain, there was a period of just 5 or 6 years where we laid over 4,000 miles of railway. That's new infrastructure. What today, back then, the trains were a bit scary. It was a new sort of thundering way of getting around. Today, we see them as the green alternative. Now, I can tell you that in a single weekend in the southwest of England, we laid nearly 200 miles of train track in one weekend, starting work on a Saturday morning, the line opened on the Monday. That boldness, that ambition, we sometimes seem to have lost. We seem to have forgotten that we can do that. But even more recently, flying is obviously a big thing. We know we've got to do less of it because it's a very polluting way of getting around. Now, there was a very famous occasion just a few years ago when, in a distant place with an unpronounceable name, there was a volcano that erupted in Iceland. And like in a second, like flicking a switch, it grounded much of the airways of the whole of the northern sphere. Now, did everything come to a standstill? No, it didn't. People found other ways to get around. They car shared, they sofa surfed, they stayed in people's flats, they used social media, other forms of transport overnight put on additional capacity. And businesses that thought they depended on flying in goods from around the world turned to local suppliers. Literally, in a couple of days, we discovered we had this incredible ability to change. Now, perhaps one of the biggest things, I mean, there's other things as well. I mean, things which perhaps we have forgotten from the public health area, changing habits on smoking. We made actions to change behaviors there, like banning tobacco advertising. You know, perhaps we should be asking the same question now, and in fact we are. Should we be ending the promotion of major polluting activities and fossil fuels themselves so that we take that out of the cultural lock-in? But perhaps the biggest example is what we've experienced in the last 2 years through the trauma of the pandemic. Because even though it's been incredibly difficult for a lot of people, I think it's told us several things. It's revealed several cracks in the way that we run the economy, the vulnerability of people we depend upon, like care workers and health workers and essential workers in our transport systems and in our shops. And I think we've learned that we need to recognize, respect, and care for them. I think we've also discovered, amazingly, that a lot of the travel that we thought was essential wasn't. No. We've learned to live without that. We learned that we were much more flexible in the ways that we work, that we could do a lot more work from home. And when we do that, rather than commuting in cars or planes, we save time, we save wear and tear on ourselves, we save money, and we save a lot of carbon. So I think it's revealed ways in which we can change our behaviors. I think in our consuming behavior as well, I think generally speaking, and I think the data shows this, we shopped a lot less. We spent more time, we learned how to do things for ourselves. We made our own entertainment, we mended things, we gardened, we cooked. A lot of people got back into baking bread. I saw so many photographs on Instagram of sourdough bread. And it's easy to kind of mock it, but it's reskilling. And I think perhaps the green economy requires us to reskill in a lot of ways. And I think it returned that agency to us, that belief that we can do things for ourselves. But there are some other really big things as well about how for that brief period during lockdown, we found that we could redesign our cities for much less car travel. We gave streets back to children. We cleaned the air. We rediscovered nature. We rediscovered the importance of our parks and green spaces. We transformed our cities, and we did it again, virtually overnight. And I think this is the kind of way we need to visualize the challenge. If we're going to deliver this change in the next 5 to 10 years, this is what we're looking at. The other thing we were reminded of perhaps, is the ability of our governments to solve other really deeply ingrained problems, like street homelessness. Because of the importance, the vital importance of public health, Solutions were found virtually overnight to end street homelessness. Now, if only we can lock in some of those lessons, I think we realize that if there's one big lesson that we can take away, that people are not that old cliche of old-fashioned mainstream economics, selfish, competitive individuals.
Yep.
I think we're really caring. I think we've got an ability to change and adapt much greater than we give ourselves credit for. And I think we look out for each other. It's that old fantastic piece of research where if you ask anybody around what their values are broadly compassionate and sharing and about helping each other out. But we've been walking around with this kind of doubt that other people think differently.
Same, yeah.
And in fact, when you look at the data, it flips both ways. Well over 70% of people say they would have compassionate and sharing and caring values, but we think over 70% of others think the opposite.
Yeah.
So we've got to believe in ourselves and see that we can achieve these changes at an extraordinary scale. We can break the old cycles of work and consumerism. We can find different ways of living. And importantly, while we're doing the behavior change, sometimes there's a sort of false dichotomy, a sort of like a tension supposed to be between behavior change or system change. It's one or the other. I think the reality is these two are intimately connected and interwoven. And when people change behaviors, politicians see that, and they see the potential for pushing policies for bigger systems change. And when you get bigger systems change, then behavior change becomes easier. I think most importantly, we've shown that we can change almost overnight, and we can put public health and public well-being before sort of short-term economic interests. So we're living through a moment where we've shown what we can do in response to, perhaps we always knew there was going to be a pandemic. We didn't know it would happen like this or be quite this bad. But we've shown what we can do in response to that. And the kind of sums of money that are going into rebuilding economies, if we can make all of that, not 20% or 30%, but all of that go towards a socially just and rapid transition, we'll be demonstrating that we can do the right thing. And to use the phrase, build back better. Because I think when people look at the changes that have to happen in a short period of time, the fear is that it's all about making sacrifice.
Yeah.
I genuinely believe that we can have better cities to live in, better homes to live in that are better insulated, more comfortable, that there could be more jobs in the green sector, and that the lessons of history, both deep history and the times that we're living through now, tell us that we should believe in our ability for rapid transition and be massively more ambitious in the kind of policies that are being pushed for changing the most polluting activities and investing in the future for the low carbon and socially just transition. And that's what the Rapid Transition Alliance is all about. And if you want to find out all the facts and figures about this, you can go to rapidtransition.org. If you're an organization, you can sign up. We would love to have more people together because as a community of interest, we're sharing what each other know, what we're learning on the ground, even now, about the possibilities for change. And on rapidtransition.org, we've got background briefings on behavior change and loads of stories about food, transport, energy, cities, about rights, all about how we can build from proven examples, proven precedents. And that's the great irony. We say the change that we need is unprecedented, but actually there's precedent everywhere that show there's a treasure trove of finding ways to massively accelerate action now.
Thank you so much for giving us the faith and the belief that's grounded in evidence that we can be more ambitious than we are now, that we can actually implement so many of the commitments that are being made and at a pace that is required. Too often we see, the feeling and the pressure that it takes too long to make systems change is not possible, or, there's an unwillingness for humans to really change their behavior and not sure what the benefits are in the end. But you've shown us just the immense human capacity to change, to adapt, also the need to believe in compassion in the community, having a care economy, not only for planet, but for each other. And it's just amazing to hear that vision laid out and feel more comfortable that we can actually achieve it. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thanks so much, Selena.
All right, this was such an incredible interview to start with, day 2 of week 2 at COP. And it's, really a